So my girlfriend and I have been watching season 2 of Interview with the Vampire. Great show, by the way, unreasonably good. And I feel compelled to talk about the fourth to last episode titled Don't Be Afraid, Just Start the Tape. Now up to this point, season 2 is focused primarily on the Parisian vampire coven and the inevitability of Claudia's something the show has not been shy of foreshadowing even since season 1. So when her story reaches a dramatic apex beyond which only heartbreak lies, it comes to something of a shock that the 5th episode puts her story on pause in favor of an entirely separate plot thread. Of the many tools in its arsenal, Interview's creators are clearly most enamored with the unreliable narrator. Through the interview frame narrative, everything we see of the past is called into question and sometimes, not always, revealed to have been a deliberate misdirection. This through line pulls double duty as an intervention not just on the life story of Louis, but on the original book as well. When Daniel Malloy is brought to Dubai in 2022 at the start of the first season, it's his second attempt at interviewing Louis after a tragic drug-addled first try in 1973, which is 3 years before the real-life publication of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. These original sessions linger over the events as described in 2022, as Daniel infrequently points out the disparity between the revulsion Louis displayed for his maker and lover Lestat in 1973, and the nostalgic warmth with which he describes him now, 49 years later. Anyone familiar with the original book or its 1994 film adaptation will be performing a similar exercise almost by rote, as this new series makes many foundational changes in direct conversation with criticisms that fans have had for more than 40 years. But so, in Don't Be Afraid, Just Start the Tape, Claudia's story takes a break, and now we see the thus far obscured 1973 interview in full. The primary function of this flashback is to invite serious skepticism of the vampire Armand, who by now has risen to the role of dual narrator alongside Louis for the last few episodes. Given that Claudia's first-hand accounts of Paris ended with the last of her diaries in episode 4, we have only Armand and Louis' words to go by as we barrel forward into the penultimate episodes. Daniel's flashback prompts this transition to pure subjectivity by kicking down the doors of the established power dynamic, revealing Armand to have manipulated the memories of Louis and Daniel's first interview to cover up his own questionable conduct. The effect this has leading up to the season 2 finale is incalculable, and yet as a creative choice it speaks to a remarkable amount of restraint and maturity. Many TV shows today, especially those adapting long-beloved properties, feel the need to give the audience everything they want when they want it. Who cares, really, about Daniel Malloy? He's barely a character in the book. Why take an entire episode to flesh out his history with vampires when we could be spending more time with Claudia? Yet Interview has the wisdom to be patient, to make bold choices that might rub fans the wrong way in service of a genuine and well-considered creative vision that extends far beyond the mere brand exercise I initially expected it to be. And this is not, to my eye at least, a particularly common approach in today's marquee franchise adaptations. It's probably not a fair comparison for a lot of reasons, but the Five Nights at Freddy's movie stands as a pretty stark example. Now, I don't go to FNAF, I haven't cared about the lore since I stopped watching Game Theory, I know I'm not the target audience, and that's fine. But I do find it pretty bizarre just how totally unwilling the FNAF movie is to cinematically intervene on the game's tropes. They've got these admittedly fantastic practical puppets, right? But what struck me most watching this film was that I basically never believed they were practical because they were consistently shot with the exact same framing and lighting as the games. The horror of which is at least partially the result of the weird-looking uncanniness of Scott Cawthon's, I hope it's not overly insulting to say amateur illustrations, but in a film, these techniques just don't accomplish what they nominally exist to accomplish. Much like the script itself, everything here exists in subservience to the source material. It is self-admittedly a secondary text that has no interest in elevating or transforming the game. Instead, it's lore-heavy and languishes in an overlong runtime, playing it obnoxiously safe in fear of a chorus of disgruntled fans who might feel betrayed by being served a farm fresh burger when they expected a lukewarm Big Mac. I'll throw Zack Snyder's Watchmen on the pile here too. There's a movie that refuses to imagine a universe in which Watchmen the movie could be anything other than Watchmen the comic, but worse. It's so devoted to recreating the original's panel compositions that it diminishes the impact of many key moments, because the visual rhetoric of comics just is not the same as the visual rhetoric of films. Maybe this is a hot, spicy take here, but a good comic book adaptation should not, under any circumstances, treat its source material as a series of storyboards. Doing so presumes that a comic is just a movie that hasn't been made yet, what the webtoons of the world might describe as cinema's side hustle. But a comic isn't a movie or a TV show, it's a comic. It's a finished artwork crafted through the medium to accomplish an affect that only that medium can create. To truly adapt a comic, you need to understand what each panel, page, and gutter placement is trying to make you feel, and then find a way to evoke that feeling through the entire separate grammar of cinema. In this way, a slavish adaptation is often the worst adaptation because it's functionally a stochastic parrot, chasing aesthetic recognition and textual verisimilitude with little to no understanding of why the original works, and thus how to effectively bridge the gap between the two different mediums. Say what you will about Damon Lindelof's Watchmen, and as the resident Damon Lindelof defender, I do think his Watchmen is overall pretty weak. I really wish he would stop trying to tell stories about cops. At the very least, his sequel series takes a lot of big, unexpected swings and goes in some admirably risky directions. Making changes in an adaptation isn't a sin, it's in fact a necessity. Interview changes a lot of things from the book, but they're all pretty smart changes that often improve the weaknesses of its source material while simultaneously enhancing its strengths. There's an intentionality to the approach here that signals a genuine comprehension of, care for, and critical perspective on Anne Rice's body of work. Compare that to the Halo show, which I have not personally watched, but that I know far too much about because some special interests you just never recover from. The Halo show makes huge changes to the series timeline and various character motivations, which I would argue is not itself a problem. The problem is that the creators of the show, by their own admission, don't really care about the story of the games and thus cannot understand what people get out of them. Their changes are made by convenience and miscomprehension, towards seemingly no greater goal than to make the story more legible to mass audiences, even though the expanse literally exists. It makes changes without respect for the source material, and so cannot be prepared for the ways those changes create internal contradictions, and even in some cases totally ruin their ability to adapt the stories that every Halo fan actually wants to see. Like, okay, TV guys, the guys who make the TV, let me give you some free advice. If you want to have a good Halo show, don't make the Master Chief the protagonist. I swear to God, they do this every single time and it just doesn't work. He's not a character. He shouldn't have to be a character. Everything interesting about his story is so much more interesting through the eyes of other, less ludically predestined characters in his orbit. The Halo universe is at its best when you just let the Chief be a comically improbable demigod that only shows his face wherever a video game is happening and a TV show isn't. Look at the Spartan Ops miniseries in Halo 4. Look at Forward Unto Dawn. Look at the friggin' Halo 3 and ODST commercials, for goodness sake. This is a setting that would print awards-worthy sci-fi if y'all would just stop hiring people who don't give a damn about Halo to make Halo media. And yes, that includes Ridley Scott. Whatever, we're getting lost in the weeds here. All I'm saying is, if your goal as Halo showrunner isn't to create the conditions for a 36-episode, 3-season adaptation of Karen Travis's Kilo 5 trilogy, then you're just a fundamentally unserious person, and you should be sent back to the sitcom mines until you remember what real hunger feels like. Okay. Anyway, so Interview with a Vampire is great. The acting, the scripts, the sets, the costumes, the lighting, the locations, the editing. Well, the editing is good, but I have a complaint. It's a small complaint, but it's a significant one because it's featured in virtually every episode of the show. One of my biggest issues with television in the streaming era has been just how bad they are at making just a single good episode of television. So often it feels like a season is just one long clump of movie arbitrarily split up to a mandatory episode count, which encourages the binge-watching model because the whole season is just one long, unpunctuated run-on sentence. Interview, thankfully, is one of a few shows bucking that trend, at least partly out of necessity due to its incorporation of ad breaks. You see this in Rian Johnson's Poker Face too, and I think it's awesome. Every show should have mandatory act breaks for ads, even if ads will never be shown, because it encourages a structure-forward mode of writing. I know that part of the appeal of streaming is freedom from the limitations of broadcast TV, but I don't think the results have really borne that out to be as useful as many hoped. Like, sure, the subjects of shows are more diverse now, but structurally they've degenerated. In broadcast, you've got to think about how each act of an episode keeps a viewer from changing channels during a commercial break. You've got to think about how each episode will keep viewers hooked enough to come back again next week, and you've got to think about how the season as a whole builds into something greater than the sum of its parts so that viewers viewers will still be thinking about the show when it comes back on the air a year from now. In streaming, only the latter is true, and at this point, getting renewed for a second season is itself such a long shot, I feel like everyone's just given up. Damon Lindelof and Tara Hernandez as Mrs. Davis is a notable example, a show about AI that miraculously actually understands how AI works in real life, which was deliberately written for a single self-contained season despite plenty of potential for more, because Lindelof said it was irresponsible now to end a show on a cliffhanger when there's basically no chance of getting a renewal. So, okay, Interview is different. It's got good episodes with strong themes, and it has discrete acts punctuated by cuts to black that give it a palatable ebb and flow. A good commercial break is a big crescendo that makes you go, whoa, and leaves you with some kind of question or compelling forward momentum that builds off an experientially finished scene. But while Interview's act breaks are well placed in the script, as edited, they are deeply frustrating. You get your whoa moment, which is the real clincher, but they always botch the cut to black by not letting the moment breathe long enough or not prompting the act break musically. So often these cuts to black leave me going less whoa and more oh. Let me give you an example. So this is season 2, episode 4. Claudia has just given her like 5 millionth performance of My Baby Loves Windows, and she's totally bored, and so she gets her applause moment, and then we get a commercial break, and then we cut to her getting notes from Armand. But we're not going to see any of that. This is just like 2 seconds. So let's see how this works effectively. Oh, so this is season 2, episode 5. Now we're in the past with Daniel Malloy. He has just been offered cocaine by Louis, and he's going to do the cocaine, and then the next scene is going to be him doing the cocaine. So let's see how this feels effectively. Oh, okay, well that scene's over, I guess. It's disorienting every time, which is frustrating because this show is otherwise so sharp, so I really don't understand why they step on their own toes like this as often as they do, which goes doubly for how they end episodes. There's already a problem with this show cutting away from the ends of its acts just a little bit too early, but it's made so much worse when an episode's conclusion is this somber, mostly quiet bit of self-reflection where you're waiting for the curtain to drop into the credits, only for them to instead cut immediately to the next time on with its garish ad-forward violin crash, followed by the perfunctory and never particularly enlightening behind-the-scenes bit, and only then do they show the credits. So here's an example of the bad episode ending in Interview. So Daniel here is listening to this interview from the past that has been cleaned up, and now he's hearing events that he had forgotten or was made to forget for the first time, and it's a big dramatic reveal that is the very end of the episode leading up into episode 5, that is the big flashback episode that I'm supposedly talking about in this video.
With a boy, things got heated with a boy. I was at home picking...
Oh! Oh!
San Francisco.
Oh! Episode's over, I guess. Wow, okay. We have this sort of beautiful close-up that pulls out. What? No! Stop it! Cut it out! Hey, quit it! Look, I'm sure this is a studio thing or a network thing. I'm not blaming any of the editors on this show, but the fact remains that this is bad editing, and it physically injures the dramatic integrity of every episode. It's like if you finished a chapter in a book, and then the next chapter started with the very next sentence without a number or a line break or a page turn. Like, yes, technically all the information you need is there, but something would still be missing, right? And this is just one of many things that wrongly maligned television classic Lost does virtuosically. None of this candy-ass silent toe-stepping. When there's a commercial break coming up on Lost, you fucking know it. Here's an example of one of Lost's commercial breaks. So now, there's a creepy monster in the woods. This is from the Lost pilot, very first episode, no major spoilers here. There's a creepy monster in the woods that everybody's just encountered. It's their first night on the beach after the crash. And there's a spooky monster in the woods, and they're reacting to the noises. And then it cuts from that to a commercial break into a flashback. Let's see how this feels.
Terrific.
Compare that with one of the examples that I pulled from Interview, where you have all of these shots that are just watching these characters react to noises. And then, what is this? There's a solid 3 seconds of silence here between when Charlie says terrific and the cut to black for the commercial break. And then when we come back up from this act break, we get a solid, that's just 12 entire seconds here of just plain noise, looking out the window, pulling back to reveal Jack. Let's talk about how an episode ends. So here's how Lost ends an episode. This is the pilot again. So,
guys, where are we?
there is a refractory period here where we build up to the big sort of like, oh my god, what the heck is going on here? And then clam, Lost. And then we get the credits. Imagine if this jumped into next time on Lost, just like before we even get to the credits here. That's a show that wants you to feel like you ate a big steak dinner when the credits roll, okay? That's a show that demands you to sit with your full belly and think about your life choices. And when it was airing, that was the only option available to us, which is why I implore you to avoid binge watching Lost as much as possible. Do 1 episode a day, maybe 2 if the getting's good. Take a week break between seasons. I know you'll want to keep watching after those colossal cliffhangers, but I promise you will have a much better time with this show if you pace yourself. Frankly though, you probably shouldn't binge watch shows just in general. It's a bad way to consume television. It turns the whole thing into a big frantic blur, and it's just as likely to make you hate what you're watching because the only thing you're actively trying to do is get it over with as fast as possible. And don't come at me in the comments talking about how you can't not binge watch because you have a condition or whatever. Temporal distance creates psychological presence. In other words, delayed gratification makes the payoff more enjoyable. Stop treating art like a gachapon. Embrace your hungry boredom and just be wanting for once in your life. Oh, but the suspense is killing me. Good, I hope you die. What was I talking about? Right, another thing Lost does better than anyone else is flashbacks. Yellowjackets is a really interesting show that's very clearly, unabashedly inspired by Lost, particularly the spectacular Oceanic 6 arc. It's about a high school girls' soccer team crashing in the wilderness and becoming cannibals, but it's also about the handful of survivors who manage to rejoin society and live normalish lives, remembering what happened some 20 years later. This is a perfect setup for a Lost-style flashback structure, where each episode focuses on one of the surviving adult women. We get to see what their life is like in the present, then we get a flashback to their perspective on the crash in the past, then back and forth between those 2 timelines for the length of the episode. Say what you will about Lost, its approach to character-focused episodes is a lightning rod for exceptional and light-footed television, and for all that Yellowjackets references Lost visually and textually, this is somehow the one thing they didn't crib. No, instead of focusing each episode on one individual character, they chose to focus on every character simultaneously across the season. This gives the series a glacial pace, because every plot thread can only advance about 2 steps per episode, since we have to take time to check in on literally everyone in literally every episode. But it's not just the pacing that suffers. This excessive intercutting leads to absolutely wild tonal shifts, as one character's comedy relief thread leads into another character's oops I just killed my child's dog thread, with seemingly zero attention paid to how they complement each other thematically. It's like, imagine if you cut together a Hurley episode with a Saeed episode with a Kate episode, and you did that every single episode, regardless of what that episode was nominally about. It'd suck! And it does suck! Yellowjackets is a great show with a fantastic cast that's utterly kneecapped by its refusal to let some characters not appear in every episode. Alright, so this is the 2nd episode of Yellowjackets. Now, this episode starts off being focused on Misty, this bespectacled creature who is wonderful and never does anything wrong. So we start with her perspective on the plane crash, the big climactic plane crash, and oh, isn't that scary? And then we get an internal flashback about Misty to show, oh, she's been bullied, and this episode is broadly about how suddenly in this crisis, Misty feels very useful. She isn't freaked out by blood and guts. and she knows how to do like emergency stuff, and it very much comes in handy in this moment where all these teen girls are freaking out about getting lost in the Pacific Northwest. So we get the title drop here, and now we're in the present, and here's Misty, one of our first glimpses of her personal life in the present. And then we cut back to the past, and here's Misty continuing to do stuff. So we're now 11 minutes and 30 seconds into this episode, and everything has been focused on Misty. But now we're about to have a transition of character. So there's this conflict happening. Misty's just cut a dude's leg off. Then we cut to her, and now suddenly, all right. So now our perspective character in the present in 2021 is her, and she's dealing with her terrible daughter that she hates. At the 15-minute, 30-second mark, we cut back to Misty. So we now have this 4-minute interlude that sort of jumps in here that is not about Misty. And then we have, from 15 minutes to 30 seconds to 22 minutes and 25 seconds, another section that is focused just on Misty. I should clarify, the teal is for present stories, and then the purple is for flashbacks. So yeah, now we have this whole long section that is about Misty, and it's also about Natalie, who's this other character who's a survivor, but it's still like primarily focused on Misty here, because she is sort of, again, the character that we've spent the most time with. And then we're back on Misty in the past. So yeah, so we're still stuck with Misty, but then we also have Natalie in the past here. Oh, completely unrelated character, suddenly. Totally unrelated character. No actual sort of relational significance. Her past self wasn't even in this scene. And then we cut back to these two being bad at sex, and then we cut back to the past, and there it is. So we have a consistent tool that's being used here. Earlier, we were in this scene that was mostly about Misty, and then it cut over to this reaction shot on Shauna, and then it uses that as a match cut to draw us into the present. So there is a continuity there, but now there is this sort of superfluous bit of present tense story that doesn't quite fit. And hey, since we're already here, I might as well go off about From, another post-Lost show run by Jack Bender, who directed a majority of the episodes of Lost, and starring Harold Perrineau, a tremendous actor whose talents were bitterly wasted by a writing staff that didn't really know what to do with his character Michael after season 2 of Lost. From sells itself on righting these two wrongs. This is a show about giving Harold Perrineau the spotlight, and this is a show where all the lore and story is planned out well in advance, unlike Lost, supposedly. To the former point, while Perrineau does get a lot to work with in From, it's honestly not that much more than what he got on Lost. And given his frustration about how Michael was made into just another absent black father figure, it's odd that they kinda do a similar thing in From. Like, for all that he's a great actor, the material he's given to work with is rarely up to snuff. From is about a town that people find themselves in when driving down old roads and wind up stuck there forever because it's in some kind of bubble. And also there's vampire monsters that run around at night, and if you don't have a talisman on your wall, then they'll get in and kill you. So there's a lot of capital M mysteries about this setting. How long has the town been here? Where does the electricity come from? What's up with all the vampires? Why are there giant spiders in the woods? What drugs were they on when they decided the Matthews family should be the audience surrogate characters? Unfortunately, these mysteries are all deployed with astonishing indifference. There are nominally two bitterly opposed camps of people in the town. Those who want to escape, and those who've accepted that escape isn't possible, but almost no time at all is spent establishing why they disagree or the ways in which their disagreement manifests materially. Everything that is taken as granted, and the boring white suburban fascist normie family we're meant to imprint on do absolutely nothing to get us on board. Like, it really feels like a show that was made by weird fascist suburbanites for weird fascist suburbanites. I'm sorry, that's just the vibe I get from this show, don't at me. In From, people either refuse to humor questions about the setting or dolefully inform the asker that someone else Lost died trying to figure that out, so it's probably best to just leave it alone. It all just ends up feeling like meaningless lore. Lost held back a lot of answers to its questions for long stretches of time, yes, but they allowed the characters to talk amongst themselves about those mysteries. Answers are posited, meanings suggested, disagreements aired, curiosities sated or whetted depending, and all the while we're being blasted with important words and phrases that will come up again. It's not just satisfying dramatically, it helps us know where the creators want us to be looking. When From refuses to let characters speculate, presumably because the creators know all the answers and don't want to tip their hand too early, it fails to humanize the mysteries and give us a reason to care. It's like modern shows want to evoke Lost, but they don't want to be accused of being Lost because, as we all know, Lost is bad and not good. So they're happy to borrow imagery and themes and visual cues, but somehow when it comes to the show's actual dramatic structure, it's like they're allergic. It's like everyone is so thoroughly bought into the hate consensus about Lost that they've shut themselves off from learning its most valuable lessons, or indeed from accurately identifying what its mistakes even actually were. Which is a shame because the flashback structure is the golden goose of Lost. It's so bulletproof in the hands of even a half-decent writer that it should by rights be a dominant subgenre of the medium at this point. The only reason it's not, as far as I can tell, is because at some point in 2010, pop culture collectively had a fucking stroke and decided that when the Lost finale was generally well liked by critics and fans across the board, that actually no it wasn't, and it was bad and everyone hated it and we're all ashamed of ever having liked it, so let's all just pretend that we never liked it and agree to never speak of this regrettable bout of cringe ever again. What's that? It sounds like I have a chip on my shoulder about Lost? No, don't be absurd. It's a boulder. Anyway, contrast these bad examples with Station 11, a perfect single season of television that is a strong contender for best of the century so far in my book. It's a post-apocalypse story about a troupe of Shakespearean actors making the rounds of various settlements in the Lake Michigan area some 20 years after a flu wiped out about 98% of the human population. Despite being a post-apocalypse, Station 11 is a heartfelt and optimistic show about why people continue to live even in the face of extinction. It eschews the entire libertarian Walking Dead style might makes right framework of the genre by hyperfixating on the ways in which human beings use art to process trauma. In this world, as would be the case in our world, the much publicized violent mobs are marginalized and self-immolating. The only way to survive in such a place is together, and the only way to stay sane is to make some weird art about it. It doesn't sell itself as such, but make no mistake, Station 11 is a post-Lost show. While there are no flashback episodes in the traditional sense, the season as a whole operates on the logic of one, with every other episode trading perspectives from today to 20 years from now. While there are no commercial breaks, the pace is zippy and intentional. Every scene accomplishes a multitude of tasks and is exactly as long as it needs to be, building up themes with razor-sharp purpose that lead to some truly satisfying singular episodes. I did misspeak in the script here. Station 11 does actually have flashback episodes. The episodes that are like the flashbacks to things that happened at the turn of the apocalypse are themselves flashback episodes where we spend time with Miranda Carroll, who is a very important side character, and we get elements of her past, and we see her right before the apocalypse and what she was doing in those circumstances. And then we also see her some years before. This is her when she first meets Arthur Leander, who is an important linchpin in the lives of various characters. So we flash back and forth. But yes, so Station 11 does very tidily use flashback episodes within a series that doesn't, or not every episode is a flashback episode in the strictest sense. So there you go. I was even more right than I thought I was. It's worth mentioning that showrunner Patrick Somerville was a staff writer on The Leftovers, Damon Lindelof's spectacular and eternally underrated follow-up to Lost. To my mind, there's a direct creative lineage where all the best ideas innovated across 6 seasons of Lost are refined and purified to their peak in 3 seasons of The Leftovers, whose best ideas are then in turn further polished into the mirror shine of Station 11's single 10-episode season. It's also cool that But, like, The Leftovers is about what would happen to society if 2% of the population disappeared overnight, right? And then Station 11 is about what would happen if 98% of the population disappeared overnight. A concept that The Leftovers itself cues up as a hypothetical question in its final season. So there's a conceptual complementarity there that sorry, I think I got distracted again. Interview with the Vampire is a spectacular showcase of what can be accomplished when you don't just borrow the flashback structure, but evolve it. Rather than Lost's floating objective camera eye, Interview has strict and consistent narrators that root the flashbacks in a material subjectivity. Going through the show again after finishing the second season, it's actually shocking how many ways they teed up minor background inconsistencies in the flashbacks. It's so much more conspicuous now how Claudia's introduction to the series is purely from her own perspective, how Louis defers to her narrativization of events to the exclusion of all else out of a desire to let the victim speak for herself. Doing so, while nominally well-intentioned, proves a self-serving choice on Louis' part as Claudia paints him as an equal victim to Lestat's villainy, helpfully transmuting his guilt for the circumstances of her creation and all that would follow into something he can safely own without feeling like a monster. Because, of course, in Claudia's eyes, it's Lestat who is the monster. But Claudia was not party to the ways in which Lestat warned Louis about turning vampires too young, nor to the interior dynamics of their relationship and the ways they treated each other in her absence. And this is not to say that the show wants to absolve Lestat of responsibility for his mistakes. On the contrary, Lestat clearly feels guilty about what happened and sort of loses his soul to it. It's not about figuring out who was the abused and who the abuser, but to explore how the narrative that there's a clear and impermeable line between the two can be weaponized to manipulate how observers perceive what occurred, to minutely shift blame in order to justify and simplify naturally complicated acts of violence. In this way, Interview is as much a show about how trauma is perceived and communicated as it is the internecine community drama of a gaggle of queening vampires. It speaks to how historical narratives are received and interpreted, what details are omitted or altered for the sake of cleanliness and respectability. It does more to introspect on the experience of living an immortal life than any other vampire story I can think of by relating it to the very real subjectivities experienced by actual mortals.
Our problems aren't about him.
And you threw her name around just for cover, but it always circled back to him.
To live is to swim in the river of history, caught in tides that began long before our birth and will continue long after our deaths. Memory is a fragile and temperamental thing, subject to the whims of she who remembers, and every moment she does the remembering. Villains, marauders, rapists, and murderers are no less people than the rest of us. There is no rest of us. We're all the same thing in the end, capable of tremendous kindness and cruelty at the drop of a pin. The scariest truth of all, which we run away from as a society in our every waking moment, is that if the monster you fear were to knock at your door, you would not recognize him. You do not know who that you love will stab you in the back, and trust me, you will feel their knife at the moment you least expect it. You do not know what obnoxious, blithering jackass will become one of your dearest friends, and trust me, you will be thankful of their chicanery at the moment you least expect it. And yet, there are the obnoxious ones who remain detestable, and those you love who never falter. How do you square that circle? Who from your own life do you remember as evil, who hurt you, who scarred you, that you could honestly say is a thing, a bloodthirsty beast, an irrevocable mount of sin incarnate? There are those who do evil, and there are those whose evil ought be punished, but they are all human, and they are not a different thing from you. Live with this truth and never forget it. To the monsters, we're the monsters. So yeah, basically, I think it's good when art is about stuff. Have you noticed that a lot of pop songs these days are just like, life can be hard, and sometimes I feel sad, but none of that matters, because just for one night, we're gonna party. It feels like a culture religiously dedicated to never looking the devil in the eye, to never questioning our primacy as protagonists of reality, nor our God-given right to just, have a good time, Just get blissed out and stop worrying so much. I mean, people go to art for escape, don't they? If I wanted to be preached at about racial dynamics in turn-of-the-century New Orleans, I would have just opened a history book. And, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's true. I think that's a profoundly boring way to live, but whatever. I'm not the cops. I'm not your mom. I'm just some goat on the internet making noises into a microphone. What was this video about? I would like to thank my $10 a month patrons: Alex, Azriel Suziminike, Athiet, Bingus, Bobby Jane DeForge, Cam Chacon, Dare, Dick Beninia, Emma Sylvia, Halsey, J Mac D, JB Silbinary Wolf, Catherine Gibbs, Lily Jade, Aura Barista, Patrick Feeney, Pinball Witch, Quirk, Richard Dunbeck, Sophia, Sophie Weberts, TB Skyen, Vesta Beaumont, Z, Bellicose, Jordan Pye, Rubeline, Scott Olson, Prum, J. Jorts, Chthonic Syzyges, Kate Shrike, Vriska Zone, Now I Only Want to Triumph, Dyke Doll, the internet's beloved Princess Grace. Television is a base art form that is appealing to our most fundamental desires. Good television is like having an orgasm.